Filcha. 1,000 welcomes to the Village Oak Tree for April 10th, 2024. My name's Terrence O'Donnell, and I'm returning again to your village to bring you some more agitation over world affairs. This week I want to talk about the United States, its allies, and their wishy-washy policies on Israel and Ukraine. This after the murders of 7 foreign aid workers in a deliberate strike by IDF soldiers who received their orders from higher up in their chain of command, although no one in their government will own up to it publicly. 2 of the unit commanders were sacked and sent to the rear instead of put under arrest for war crimes. I know, everything that can be said about this horrible act of deliberate murder has been said by every news outlet around the world by now, which is where I found these stories I'm drawing from today. I also have a couple of articles from a Substack writer and a couple of pieces from an English writer on Medium.com. He'll be reading one of them himself for us, which I will share with everyone at the end of the show today. So let me start with an article that came out on Al Jazeera that says the U.S. has not, I quote, found any incidents of Israel violating international humanitarian law in the last 6 months, or I might also add in the last 75 years. So I guess apartheid and obvious genocide doesn't count in the U.S. law books as violations of international humanitarian law. As always, since 1907, when Teddy Roosevelt strutted the Great White Fleet around the world, the U.S. makes its own laws, and they carry the biggest stick with them around the world, so their judicial point of view trumps everyone else's in the world. Biden's rebuke of the IDF over this obvious breach of international law is too little, too late. These 7 people were all mostly European, from the UK, or in one case, a Canadian-American Brit. Yeah, he had 3 passports. One was apparently the interpreter from Palestine. Either way, Biden is outraged now over the 7 non-Palestinian casualties. After more than 33,000 Palestinians been wiped out with more to come? What about all the Arab journalists and aid workers who were killed in the last 6 months? Where's the outrage over that? There's very little, of course, because they're Arabs from one of those shithole countries over there, to quote Donald Trump from a few years ago. And white leaders don't get very upset about thousands being killed until one or some of their own get taken out. Now it's all hands on deck. Now let's stop the ammunition and funding because they killed some Europeans and North Americans. What the West doesn't get is that Netanyahu and his coalition never had any rules of engagement after October 7th. Not that they had many before that. But after October 7th, the mask came off and Israel declared Gaza a free fire zone with only one rule: shoot or kill anyone moving. Whether it was in the buildings they bombed or just shooting them on the streets like rabid animals because, as a couple of Israeli ministers have declared, they're all animals. Apparently, this also applies to clearly marked journalists and aid workers. This is their justification to their ground commanders. Shoot them all. Leave no one left alive. They're all Hamas, cooperating with Hamas, or hiding Hamas soldiers. Ignoring the UN is starting to become a little costly for Israel as world support for ceasefire is ramping up. More and more little countries are signing up with South Africa, Ireland, Spain, and others to push for a ceasefire, which was ignored until Biden said enough. And that was right after these aid workers got killed. No official ceasefire yet, but now the IDF is pulling back a little and sitting down to a table with Hamas leaders in Egypt. No deals yet, though. The U.S. is losing serious credibility with world leaders everywhere, especially since they are still squabbling over whether to help Ukraine stand off the Russians. The GOP doesn't get it. And since they are the majority in the House of Representatives, only by 1 seat now, they hold the purse strings. The idea of letting Putin have the eastern portion of Ukraine is only going to make things worse for Eastern Europe, and they know it. The same for Gaza. By letting Israel do what they want everywhere there, the U.S. is setting itself up for failure. They're damned if they do and damned if they don't because of this declaration of support. Israel is counting on Big Brother to help them out with whatever they want to do over there. Everyone knows now, since they announced it, that certain factions in the U.S. GOP don't want to spend any money on anyone in Europe so they can defend themselves against Russia. They sure will send money to Israel because they're religiously affiliated, so they think. They also take a fact-finding trip to Israel and ask working-class Israelis what they think of Christians. I don't think they would like the answer they would get back. But Ukrainians are Christians, according to a couple of ultra-right-wing politicians lately. Israel is nowhere near eliminating Hamas after 6 months, and they are trying to hide that under all the dead bodies in Gaza. Now they are fighting more with Hezbollah in Lebanon because of their arrogance. Iran is looking to retaliate for the loss of their top generals in Damascus. Israel knows they can't fight them all at the same time. They could do some serious damage, but would ultimately run out of manpower and weapons before anyone cried uncle. That's what everyone in the West is scared of now, escalation. No one wants this to turn into a regional war. The West would stand to lose too much oil, and they can't have that, especially Biden in an election year. Europe is also scared for the same reasons. If the price of petrol goes way up again, there could be a lot more unrest in Europe, and they don't want that again. So, everyone wants Israel to calm down and back off. Find another way to take care of Hamas besides continuing this genocidal humanitarian crisis. As it stands last weekend, Israel did pull all but one, well, in this case, I heard one story as 2 infantry brigades out of South Gaza to rest and refit. Meanwhile, they're mobilizing more troops on their northern border in Israel to prevent Hezbollah from pulling another October 7th. Israel has also opened 2 corridors in Ezra to let in more humanitarian aid trucks. Whoopee! They're letting in a few more trucks, but only after Biden pitched a fit over the 7 dead aid workers. Yesterday, the British RAF, along with some other Air Force planes, made a bunch of food drops. Helpful, but nowhere near enough. Israel's Netanyahu was still planning to invade Rafah, and they're telling the world it will be soon. Is it a bluff? I heard something in the news this morning that they may be bluffing. We'll have to wait and see. Palestinians returning to Khan Yunis found nothing to return to. The city's been flattened and is largely uninhabitable now, likely by design of the Israeli government. The UN is now requesting an accounting of possible war crimes. Imagine that. IDF soldiers shooting kids on the street, deliberately withholding food, water, medical care, and other basics for survivors doesn't constitute as war crimes according to the US and the UK, and they make the rules. Hey, United Nations, what part about that don't you understand yet? I would have thought you would have learned that when George W. Bush was president, when he wanted to go after Saddam Hussein. I guess not. Should be pretty obvious that Israel, the UK, and the US could care less what the ICJ and the UN care or say about Gaza. The US is calling the tunes. They have been since the late 1940s. The US military-industrial complex controls the Western world, or they used to anyway. They still do to a large extent, but nothing like in the aftermath of World War II and the 2 decades afterwards. The scandals of the Vietnam War, Afghanistan, and Iraq kind of took some of the stuffing out of them over the years. In 2001, George W. Bush stepped into the limelight. The coward. The Vietnam War deserter whom Daddy bailed out. Does anyone ever wonder why he stays out of the spotlight so much these days? He doesn't participate much in ex-president things like the others do, if you think about it. I would hazard an educated guess that it's because he knows how badly he screwed the country up and is trying to keep a low profile to avoid anyone bringing it up. Back to Israel. I read an opinion piece from another Al Jazeera journalist who tells everyone that Israel doesn't want anyone to feed the Palestinians. If they can starve them into leaving, Israel can move in and take over the ceded lands and get what they've always wanted, the promised land that their God gave them when Abraham brought them there thousands of years ago. That and all the oil underneath, the land to dig up for the new Ben Gurion Canal, and the lands of the West Bank for the settlers, from the river to the sea. The US and the UK and some EU countries are complicit in these war crimes by supplying arms, but no one will ever be held accountable. The US will see to that, especially since Biden is now saying enough after the murder of the Westerners. Israel is now backing off and letting more aid in after their little spat. They know who their benefactors are, and have realized that they crossed a line, maybe just a little bit. These countries are still sending munitions and aid, though. Meanwhile, Ukraine is running on air. They're running out of air defense missiles, bullets, and other munitions needed to keep the Russians out of Ukraine. They're also running out of the most vital asset of all, soldiers. Eastern Europe is gearing up for a Russian invasion. Finland has closed their Russian-facing border now indefinitely. The EU is trying to push their arms factories past their limits in their fear of a possible war with Russia. Moldova, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Romania, and Poland are standing up their meager defense forces and crying to the EU for more. The EU is making motions that they will no longer depend on the US or UK for help. Where's the US in all of this? Sitting on their hands, wrangling over their southern border, trying to barter border security for arms and money for Ukraine. Meanwhile, Secretary of State Blinken is holding out a carrot called a mission to NATO for Ukraine. What good is a mission to NATO for Ukraine if they are no more once Russia overruns their defenses? A stupid gesture with no meaning to it, but it's a clickbait-worthy story for the news media, especially since the U.S. was against it 2 years ago due to their geographical closeness to Russia and the possibility of an invasion. Stupid Americans. I have another story about how Russia is now using chemical weapons against Ukrainian soldiers in the trenches. So far, they're just reporting tear gas grenades dropped from drones. That is still violating international laws of war adopted after World War I. Could Russia get desperate and start pulling in Assad, dropping sarin gas on the front lines or worse? What would NATO and the U.S. do if they did? They didn't do anything but cry when Assad dropped his 50-gallon drums of nerve gas on his people. What makes anyone think they would do anything different with the Russians? More crying and hand-wringing, and that would be it, while the poor Ukrainian soldiers die an excruciating death in the trenches. Recently, certain American politicians have said publicly that Ukraine could end this war if they just gave Russia the lands in the eastern region they want. We all know that's not what Russia wants. Putin has said he wants all of the satellite countries back that the USSR controlled back before the collapse. This means not only Ukraine, but Georgia, Moldova, Romania, Bulgaria, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, for starters. Mostly easy marks for Russia once they have secured Ukraine. Belarus, Slovakia, and Hungary are already ready to give themselves up to Russia now. Poland would give Putin a big headache, but a NATO without the United States will not be able to hold him off for long. This is what Putin is counting on. Europe without its big brother, the United States. A new world order. Of course, on the other side of the world, China is also making strides in taking its place in the new world order. They are working hard at becoming self-sufficient so they can't be strangled by economic sanctions like so many other countries who have run afoul of the U.S. in the last few decades. The U.S. doesn't like to be challenged on the world's political and economic stage, so they're slandering China as warmongers and imposing trade restrictions and so on. China has no desire to go to war with anyone, despite their newly found military prowess. They know that what they have is largely a weak military that would fold under a lot of pressure, such as from the U.S. submarine fleet and maybe the aircraft carriers. But you can't tell the U.S. GOP warhawks that. Of course, all this media posturing is like a bad commercial, paid for by the military-industrial complex. They don't make money unless someone, somewhere, is waging war on someone around the world. No wars, no paydays. So if they can purchase a few congressmen to push for more arms sales, so much the better for them. And that's the crux of it all. Money and power. Netanyahu is desperate to stay in power in Israel so his party can reap the benefits of all that oil under Gaza and rid the land of Palestinians once and for all. The U.S. GOP MAGA people are desperate for power in the United States and are willing to sacrifice anyone around the world to get it. They don't know what they will do once they do take over, but they'll worry about that after they get the keys to the castle. Maybe they will suck up to Putin a little more and let the Russians in the gate to help them run the country. Putin is desperate to leave a legacy for the Russian history books, much like his predecessors, Joseph Stalin, Catherine the Great, and Ivan the Terrible. And he's willing to sacrifice millions of Russians to achieve that legacy. In the United States, the current administration is trying to hold on in a very shaky environment. Biden is beset on all sides, including his personal beliefs, by enemies at home and abroad. Is he capable of leading the country out of the swamp he has created with his support for Israel? Doesn't look good, and there's no one else to step in for him. The U.S. voters, once again, are facing a choice of the lesser of two evils in the upcoming election. And that is subjective, as a large portion of the country does not like Biden's policy on Israel and are being forced towards an even worse choice, Donald Trump. Many sane people from outside the U.S. know what will happen if Trump and his MAGA people take over the U.S. and are already starting to prepare for it. Say goodbye to NATO. Say goodbye to Ukraine. Say goodbye to the Palestinians. Another trade war with China, and so on, as he has promised in his rally speeches. Will he keep his word? Again, he's a consummate liar. So it's anyone's guess, but since MAGA legislatures are behind him, I would say probably yes to most of this. This is where the United States finds itself these days. Boxed into a corner of their own making, and the walls are closing in faster now. World opinion is no longer as favorable as it once was. They've lost some of their financial credit rating with the world over their internal money wrangling about their southern border, abortion rights, and so much else. So I'm going to leave it at that. Let me take a little break for a couple of minutes and listen to my intermission. I'll be back. During this couple-minute break, I have a couple of things I wish to bring to your attention. First, I want to invite everyone to listen to Reese Across America Radio. Search out www.reaseacrossamerica.org/radio by typing in the word Reese in these mobile apps, iHeartRadio, Odyssey, or TuneIn. Or find them on a web browser and join me to listen to the show and support WAA Radio, Whiskey Alpha Alpha Radio for any veterans or first responders listening. Reese Across America is a nonprofit radio station that supports veterans programs and organizations that help needy veterans. By joining me in supporting WAA Radio, you're helping to support veterans in need across the U.S. So search it out and enjoy the shows they have to offer. Thank a veteran while you're at it. I want to take another minute to ask for a donation of any amount to help me keep this podcast going and to advertise my book. First, just to let you know, this podcast will remain free to subscribe to on all the major mobile podcast apps and on my YouTube channel, Crown of Biha. And for the first 30 days on my Substack page, crownofbiha@substack.com. I'm asking for donations because it costs me a goodly amount of money to produce this show. I have set up a donation tab on the Village Oak Tree webpage at rss.com and a donation page on my website at www.crownofbiha.com, linked to PayPal for your security. This way there's no credit card info saved anywhere, and you can use any currency you wish around the world, providing PayPal is available to you. I want to tell you how to find my website. The easiest way is to copy it from the background behind me if you're watching this on YouTube. If you're listening to an audio version, take the website name from the podcast logo shown and search for it. Lastly, let me tell you about my fictional dystopian future book, Fugitives in the New United States. It is out for sale around the world through two of the most prominent booksellers, Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Also with Ingram Spark if anyone's looking to stock a library or school reading program. You may also buy a hardcover or paperback edition directly from me through my website at the bookstore page, and I'll ship one right out to you. It's written for young adults and upward, but as the main characters are Muslim and Wiccan, minor children should ask their parents' permission before reading this in case there's any biases. We don't want anybody to get any trouble at home. There's only a little bit of mild violence and no bad language, if that helps. So search it out and read it. It might make you think a little bit. So thank you for your patronage and support. Now back to the show. Welcome back. Let's pick up where we left off before the break. The United States is like an old ship that's slowly sinking. Welcome back. Let's pick up where we left off before the break. The United States is like an old ship that's slowly sinking because the hull is so full of holes due to all its battles. And no amount of patching anymore can stop the slow settling down into the water. The rats are all leaving, so the handwriting is on the wall. The United States is on the verge of losing its place among the superpowers of the earth if it doesn't find a way forward soon. They're running out of time. The federal government had better come up with a plan to manage its relationship with Israel, because Israel is going its own way, and it won't be pretty once they're finished. Tens of thousands of Israelis are protesting there right now, and unless Netanyahu wants a revolt on his hands that he feels he has to quell with soldiers, something will have to give. They want him out and a new government installed. Himself and his cronies don't want to leave, and that's a recipe for disaster. What will Biden do if Netanyahu gets ousted and a new government takes over? I would bet that Biden and company will kiss their butts every which they can to maintain their current relationship, no matter what the new government does in Gaza and the surrounding region. Remember, it's all about the money. The U.S. stands to lose too much money if they part company with Israel. which I doubt they will. Israel will still need those billions in foreign aid that the U.S. just hands over every year to use as they wish. Not that the Palestinians have ever seen any of that money in Gaza or the West Bank. That would be asking too much from the colonizers. Nor would any future Israeli government ever change their tune and decide to take care of their colony as they should. After all, no matter who is in charge of Israel, the Palestinians and other Gentiles around the world are still just animals. Stay tuned for my friend Martin Morrison, who sent me a recording of himself reading his story, Al-Ibadah, The Annihilation. Warning, he has a thick Liverpool accent, but the story is spot on regarding Western attitudes. I'll be back again next week with an interview with another controversial guest. Sláinte.
Al-Ibadah, The Annihilation. Written and narrated by Martin Morrison, British writer. Jack turned off the small chainsaw and took a few steps back to admire his handiwork. With the hedge as neatly trimmed as his freshly mowed lawn, he looked forward to sitting with a glass of orange juice on the patio. The smell of grass cuttings hung in the air along with the sound of another mower somewhere close and children playing in a nearby school. Blue sky, light wisps of cloud, an almost imperceptible wind, and a feeling of beads of sweat trickling from his forehead completed the picture. It was an ideal summer afternoon. "Hey, Grandad." "Hello, young man. Back so soon? How was uni today?" Mark, a strapping 20-year-old, had left early because one of his lecturers was absent and he had a free period. "We finished with a library session and it was too hot and stuffy in there, so I thought I'd come and spend some time with you and your—" He paused for a second, looking around open-mouthed before continuing, "Amazing garden. You've been busy, haven't you?" "Yes, Mark, and now it's all done, so you're just in time for some refreshments. Grandma's coming out with some fruit and orange juice any second. Oh, speak of the devil," a sprightly, older lady with long, flowing, greying hair, good skin and a natural smile was placing a tray on the table next to the house. She noticed the guest and her face lit up. "Oh, what a lovely surprise, Jack. It's my wonderful grandson. Come here and let me give you a kiss," she boldly announced with a chuckle, walking quickly towards Mark. "I know, you're not a little boy anymore, but you'll always be my grandson, and you'll never be too old to give your grandma a hug and a kiss." With a beaming smile, what else could he do? Mark succumbed to her wishes, took her in his arms, and felt her plant a juicy one on his cheek. Not letting go, she started pulling him back towards the house. "Now you sit yourself down and tell us what you've been up to. You too, hubby. You've been hard at it all day. Come and relax." The three of them sat down and exchanged pleasantries. Mark's grandmother, Margaret, wanted to know how things were going with his new girlfriend. That is, to sense whether there was any possibility of marriage and great-grandchildren, while his grandfather rolled his eyes discreetly, so only Mark could see. After a short while, they fell into a natural silence, and Jack seized the opportunity to bring up a new subject. "How's the course, Mark? Are you enjoying it?" The student paused to consider his thoughts and formulate a suitable response. He didn't think he'd given anything away, but Margaret had picked something up from his demeanour. "Everything all right? You look very serious." "It's fine, Nan. It's definitely the right course for me, and things are going well." "But," interrupted Margaret, "some of the stuff I'm learning is heavy," Mark began. "We've been learning about the history of Gaza and Al-Ibadah." "Al what?" Jack asked. "The annihilation. That's what the Arabs call Gaza's destruction from 2024. It was brutal. Mr. Edwards described it as one of the swiftest episodes of ethnic cleansing in history. Within the space of a few months, Gaza's population were either slaughtered, dead from starvation, or forced into the desert, while the world watched, armed them. Several countries, including the UK and America, were complicit. A less comfortable silence followed, which was broken when Margaret asked if anyone would like some more fruit juice. As she disappeared into the apparent darkness of the house, Jack sat up in his chair and addressed his grandson. "Mark, That will always be a brutal stain on history, no doubt about that, but it wasn't as cut and dry as you suggest. Our governments, the media, and politicians of all persuasions told us it was a war, that Israel was acting in self-defense. Mark's brows furrowed. What about the ruling from the International Court of Justice that a plausible genocide was taking place, Israel's blockade of aid getting into the country, and the global protests? These things occurred before the ICJ's eventual verdict was delivered and the subsequent hearings in The Hague. Surely those things were easy to see. It's easy to look back and say it should have been obvious, Mark. It wasn't. We believed what we were being told. Muslims were known for committing acts of terror all around the world. Jihadists, fundamentalists, fanatics who were unwilling to live side by side with their neighbours. Sorry, Jack. I have to disagree with you, Margaret shouted from the living room as she approached with the fresh orange and sandwiches. September the 11th, Jack rebounded. July the 7th, Manchester Arena, and do I have to remind you of the Hamas attack on whenever it was in October? They started it. Oh, come on, Jack, Margaret protested with a smile intended to disarm. You never did like Muslims. Why don't you just admit it? You grew up in an all-white mining town and knew no Muslims when I first met you. In fact, you hardly knew anyone from anywhere else but Yorkshire. You were one of the only people I knew who referred to my cousin as half-caste. I sometimes wondered what century you were from. Jack's face took on a more displeased countenance, but before he could say anything, Margaret added, I'm not saying you were racist, hubby. I wouldn't have married you if I'd thought that for a second, and it wasn't your fault that you grew up in a village. But that doesn't change the facts. You didn't question the narrative because you didn't know any better. Even the mainstream news, which was very one-sided, was forced to reveal things which were hard to explain away. Israel's army, it's IDF, Mark interjected. Yes, them. Well, actually, many were calling them the IOF, an occupying force, not a defensive one. They were killing anything that moved. Even Israeli hostages were waving white flags. Journalists, unarmed civilians, aid workers, hospital staff. Murdered in cold blood. Hamas! Ranted Jack, not quite shouting, but sounding exasperated. They were trying to fight Hamas. What else did you expect them to do? Rubbish, Jack. You'll be rolling out human shields next. We heard it all. Tunnels, human shields, self-defense, like the WMDs that Saddam was supposed to have in Iraq. No credible evidence was ever presented. As if the Hamas attack that triggered the genocide, yes, I'm going to call it what it was, wasn't bad enough. They fabricated stories about babies being beheaded, which the US president swallowed hook, line and sinker. He went on to say he'd seen the footage, but had to retract that statement later because there weren't any beheaded babies, let alone photographic or video evidence. The American paper which published the article, she turned towards Mark, who instinctively knew what to do. The New York Times, he remembered, helping out his nan. The fact that the article had been discussed in a history lecture that day meant it was fresh in his mind. Yes, she nodded. Their article was cancelled, but everyone knows lies travel quicker than the truth. By the time the truth was out, the lies had done a round-the-world trip and were sipping champagne in a fancy restaurant. You always were a bit of a lefty, Margaret, Jack threw in, trying and failing to diffuse things as his wife was looking visibly agitated. Oh, Jack, don't. Just don't. Mark, it was a very upsetting time. I don't agree with your granddad. I knew what was going on, but I will also admit this. People were afraid to speak out. To do so risked being accused of anti-Semitism. A friend of mine used to shout about it at every opportunity, but he was self-employed, a writer. He never shut up about it. God knows how he didn't lose any clients. I knew other people who found themselves out of a job. It's in the past now, Margaret. Gone. Let's put it behind us. We can't change the past, Jack said, still trying to soften her. It is, Grandad, Mark piped up. Where once were thriving communities of Palestinians, hospitals, universities, and one of the highest literacy rates in the world, despite living in apartheid conditions. What do we have? Israeli holiday resorts and hotels, getaway homes, and caravan parks. It makes you wonder if that was what it was all about from the beginning. Jack said nothing. Mark put his head down. Feels like rain, said Margaret. Is that the time already?
Thank you for listening to the show today. I hope you enjoyed it, and you'll return again for another episode of the Village Oak Tree. Please share this podcast with your friends and relations. The more you share, the more we can convince enough people to make the world a better place to live in. This is Shauna K. I hope you'll continue to let me travel to your village to bring you some news from the world outside that might make you think a little after we part for the day. As I say goodbye this week, I wish to leave you with this Irish blessing as you go about your day. May the saddest day of your future be no worse than the happiest day of your past. Slán go fóill, which means goodbye for now in Irish.